Hello and welcome back to Reform Thinking. It is good to be back at the table with you.
It is good to be here.
Usually when we sit down to prep for one of these, we're looking at, well, abstract theology or maybe some cultural commentary
Yeah, deep, but, in the books.
in the books. But the stack of papers you sent over this week, this feels different. It feels like a techno thriller.
It does, doesn't it?
Yep.
It's got all the elements.
It really does. I mean, we have international espionage, sort of. We have, secret vaults in Belgium. We have hundreds of billions of dollars at stake. And we have a moral dilemma that is literally life and death for an entire nation.
Right.
But before we get to the spy novel stuff, let's ground everyone. We are two friends. We are Protestant Christians. We hold to the Westminster Confession. And we are trying to look at the headlines without losing our theological mind.
Which I have to say is getting harder and harder to do every day.
Amen to that. So let's look at the object at the center of the table today. It is a pile of money, a massive pile of money.
We're talking about roughly 260 billion euros, which is nearly 300 billion US dollars.
To put that in perspective for you listening, that is larger than the entire annual GDP of Finland.
Wow.
It is more than the GDP of Portugal. I mean, it is a truly staggering amount of wealth. And since February 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this money has been, what's the word? Ghosted.
Immobilized is the technical term they use.
Right, immobilized. It's frozen. And most of it isn't sitting in New York. It's not in London. It's sitting in a very specific and probably very boring building in Brussels, Belgium, in the vaults of a company called Euroclear.
And that geographical detail, the fact that it is in Belgium, is actually the hinge that this whole legal and moral argument turns on. But we'll definitely get to that.
Okay, so here is the setup for today's deep dive. We are looking at two documents that are trying to solve the same problem, but they're coming from totally different universes.
Completely different starting points.
Source number one is a secular legal breakdown. It's called the Reparations Trilemma. It's very dry, it's technical, and it is terrifyingly pragmatic. It's basically asking, how do we fix this without breaking the entire global banking system?
Right. It's a logistical puzzle. Who pays? Who decides who pays? And who gets protected in the process?
And then we have source number two, which is right in our wheelhouse. It's a theological paper titled The Scales of Justice and the Nations. And this author looks at that same pile of frozen money and says, wait a minute, hang on. This isn't just about banking regulations. This is about mishpat.
Biblical justice.
Right. It argues that what we're witnessing is this massive collision between the biblical necessity of restitution, the thief paying back the victim, and this very modern fear of using what it calls uneven weights and measures.
Changing the rules to suit the moment.
Exactly. It warns us about what happens when you centralize authority, even when you think it's for a really good cause. It uses terms like global technocracy.
And that frames the conflict perfectly. On one hand, you have the trilemma, the secular pragmatic problem, and on the other, you have the biblical mandate. And, they do not align comfortably at all.
Let's unpack that trilemma concept first, because the secular source uses it to frame everything, and I want to make sure I understand it. A trilemma usually means you have three options, but you can only pick two, right? Like the old project management joke. Fast, good, cheap pick two.
That's precisely the idea. In this context, the author argues that Western policymakers are trapped between three competing goals. Goal number one is justice for the victims.
Okay.
That means getting money to Ukraine now, as in yesterday. While they are fighting for their very survival, speed is the absolute priority here.
That makes sense.
Goal number two is upholding the rule of law. You want to protect property rights. You want to respect this thing called sovereign immunity. Basically, you don't want to act like a pirate state just because you're fighting a pirate state.
You don't want to become the monster you're fighting?
Exactly. And then goal number three is financial stability. You do not want to spook the markets. You don't want to cause a run on the euro or the dollar. You don't want to break the fundamental plumbing of the banking system.
So the trilemma is, if you want justice, meaning speed, and you want financial stability, you probably have to bend or even break the rule of law.
Right.
And if you want to stick to the rule of law and keep the market stable, you probably have to sacrifice justice for the victims, because they're not going to get the money anytime soon.
That is the trap. And for the last 2 years, the West has been completely paralyzed by this. We have been staring at this huge pile of money, wanting to take it, but absolutely terrified of the consequences.
And this is where the theological source comes in and just, makes things really uncomfortable. It looks at that paralysis and says, that's interesting that you're so worried about the banks, but God's law has a very specific opinion on what happens when one nation destroys another.
It shifts the entire focus from can we do this safely to must we do this morally?
Before we dive into the nitty-gritty, we absolutely need to do a quick disclaimer. We're dealing with high voltage lines here.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about a hot war, geopolitics, massive financial interests. These sources have very strong opinions. The theological source is very reformed, very skeptical of global authority. The legal source is very pragmatic, very establishment. We are not here to tell you how to vote.
Yep.
We are not here to endorse a specific foreign policy. We are here to report on these arguments. We want to see if we can understand the logic that's driving these incredibly difficult decisions.
We are observers. We're
Yeah.
trying to apply a Christian mind to a very difficult issue.
So let's start at the very bottom, definitions. Segment 1. Secular source makes a massive distinction between three words that I think most people, myself included, use interchangeably: aid, sanctions, and reparations. Why does it matter so much which word we use?
It matters because of the moral standing of the money. Let's start with aid. Aid is discretionary. It's humanitarian. If your house burns down and I give you $1,000, that's aid. I'm doing it because I'm nice. I'm doing it out of charity.
It's a gift.
It is a gift. But crucially, it implies no guilt on my part. I didn't burn your house down. I'm just helping you rebuild it.
Okay, then what about sanctions?
Sanctions are a tool. They're coercive. I stop trading with you, or I freeze your assets to pressure you to change your behavior. Stop the war, and you get your money back. That's the basic logic of sanctions. They're meant to be temporary and conditional.
But reparations, that is a different beast entirely, isn't it?
Completely. Reparations are a legal remedy that is tied directly to wrongdoing. In international law, we look at something called the Articles on State Responsibility. These are sort of the baseline rules of how nations are supposed to treat each other. And the rule is simple. If a state commits an internationally wrongful act, like, say, invading a sovereign neighbor, it is obliged to make full reparation for the injury caused.
Full reparation. That sounds comprehensive.
It is full. That means material damage, rebuilding the bridges, the hospitals, the homes, and moral damage. The stated goal is to wipe out all the consequences of the illegal act. It's about making the victim whole again.
So if we send Ukraine money from the U.S. budget, that's aid, we're being charitable. But if we take Russia's money and give it to Ukraine, that's reparations. That is satisfying a debt.
That is exactly correct. And this is where the theological source gets really, really fired up. It opens up the book of Exodus, specifically Exodus chapter 22, verses 1 through 4.
I love it when we get to the text. Walk us through the general equity of this. What does that mean?
So general equity is a classic reform term. It means that while we are not ancient Israel, we don't stone people for picking up sticks on the Sabbath, the moral principle that's underneath the civil law. That principle still applies to nations today.
The spirit of the law, not the letter.
You could say that. And Exodus 22 says this: if a man steals an ox or a sheep and kills it or sells it, he shall repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep.
It's very specific math, very precise.
It is. But look at the principle. It is not just about saying, I'm sorry. It is not even just about returning the stolen item. If I steal your ox and I still have it, okay, I give it back plus a penalty. But if I destroyed it, if I can't give it back, well, then I owe you massive restitution, 5-fold.
Why a 5-fold? Why not just 1 for 1? That seems fair.
Because you've disrupted the shalom, the peace of the community. Yeah. You've taken a productive asset, an ox was a tractor in those days, and you destroyed it. You didn't just take the object, you took the victim's future productivity. You took their livelihood. Restitution is about restoring the victim to the position they would have been in if the crime had never, ever happened.
That is a very high bar.
It is an incredibly high bar.
Right.
And the theological argument in this source is that currently the West is failing this standard spectacularly. Right now, the World Bank estimates the damage in Ukraine at something like $486 billion, and it's still counting. Who is paying for that?
Well, right now, it's U.S. taxpayers, it's EU taxpayers, and of course, the Ukrainians themselves with their own lives and what's left of their economy.
Precisely. The innocent are paying. Meanwhile, the aggressor's $300 billion is just sitting in a vault in Belgium, completely untouched. The theological source calls this a profound subversion of justice. It argues that we are forcing the innocent to subsidize the guilty.
That really hits home when you frame it that way. It's not just let's grab the cash, it's Why are we paying for the arsonist's damage while the arsonist keeps his bank account?
Yes.
And here's but the reason the arsonist still has his bank account is not because we love him, it's because of this really tricky legal distinction between freezing and seizing.
Right. This is the legal wall that everyone keeps hitting. Currently, the assets are immobilized. They're frozen. That means Russia still holds the title deed. It is their property. We've just put a padlock on the door.
We've paused their access to it.
Yes. Seizing or confiscating, on the other hand, means we take the title deed. We legally transfer ownership from Russia to, say, a trust for Ukraine.
And why is that so hard? I mean, if I sued you and won, the court would seize your assets to pay the judgment. Why can't we just do that to Russia?
Because Russia is not a person. It is a sovereign state. And under international law specifically, the UN Convention on Jurisdictional Immunity State Property gets special treatment. But here's the nuance the deep dive listeners really need to get. There is a difference between a state asset and central bank reserves.
Okay, unpack that.
If the Russian government owns, say, a building in New York that they use for trade missions, that's a state asset. It has some protection, but it's not absolute. But central bank reserves, these are the sacred cows of international finance. They are the currency reserves held by one nation's central bank inside another nation's system.
Right.
The assumption for centuries really has been that central bank reserves are absolutely immune. You do not touch them, period. Because if you do, you break the trust that allows nations to trade with each other.
It's the common grace of the financial system. Even if we hate each other, I need to know my money is safe in your bank, or I will never buy your wheat, and you'll never buy my oil.
Precisely. If you start seizing central bank reserves, you are weaponizing the very foundation of global trade. The secular source warns that if we cross this line, if we move from freeze to seize, we might be opening a Pandora's box that we simply cannot close.
So that is the tension. We have a moral mandate that screams, the thief must pay. We have a legal structure that screams, do not touch the reserves. And stuck right in the middle, we have politicians desperately trying to find a loophole.
And they think they've found one.
They call it Plan C, or as I like to call it, the magic money tree.
The interest-only compromise, yeah.
Let's get into the weeds of this in segment 2, because this is where the financial engineering gets really clever, and according to our theological source, really morally dubious.
It is the current strategy of the G7 and the EU. Since they are afraid to seize the principal, that 210 billion block of cash in Belgium, they've decided to go after what they call the extraordinary revenues.
The interest.
Yes, but let's be technical here for a second, because it is not just simple bank interest like you or I would get. The mechanics are really important. Euroclear is what's called a central securities depository. So when a Russian bond matures, say a German government bond that Russia owns, the German government pays out the cash to Euroclear.
Okay, so now Euroclear is holding a big pile of cash that legally belongs to Russia.
Correct. Normally, they would wire that cash to Moscow immediately, within minutes. But because of the sanctions, the wire is blocked. The cash is just stuck there in Belgium.
And cash that sits still does nothing.
Well, Euroclear is a bank, a highly regulated one. They can't just leave billions of euros in a shoebox. They have to manage their balance sheet. So they reinvest that cash balance. They put it into very short-term, very risk-free instruments. And because interest rates in Europe have been surprisingly high recently, that stuck cash is generating massive returns.
We're talking billions.
We are. In just 9 months, it generated over 3 billion euros. This is what they call windfall profit. It's money that nobody expected to exist. It's not Russia's principal. It's the profit generated by the freeze itself.
So the G7 looks at this and says, aha, free money.
Essentially, yes. They created something called the Extraordinary Revenue Acceleration Loans, or ERA loans. It's a mouthful, but the idea is actually pretty simple. The G7 lends Ukraine $50 billion today.
So cash up front for Ukraine.
Right. And then the G7 countries pay themselves back over the next 10 or 20 years, using that stream of interest income from the frozen assets.
It's basically a cash advance on future interests.
That is the mechanism, exactly.
But the source asks a really sharp question. Who actually pays if things go wrong?
And that is the multi-billion-dollar risk. What if the war ends next year, and part of the peace deal is that the assets have to be returned to Russia?
Then the interest stream stops.
It stops. Or what if interest rates in Europe drop back to zero? That income stream dries up. Who pays back the $50 billion loan then?
It's not Russia.
No. The risk sits with the Western taxpayers, the G7 nations. We're essentially co-signing a loan for ourselves, hoping that Russia's money will pay it back for us. But the theological critique cuts even deeper than just the financial risk. The reform source looks at this Plan C and calls it a moral failure.
How so? I mean, it gets money to the victim. Isn't that a good thing?
It is good, but it's what the source calls proximate justice at best. The critique is about moral hazard. It uses this phrase that I found really powerful: protecting the root while only taking the fruit.
That's a vivid image.
The root is the principal, the billions that actually belong to the Russian state. The fruit is just the interest. The theological argument is that this whole approach leaves the aggressor's core wealth safe and sterile. It is untouched. We are just skimming the profits, but the thief gets to keep all his capital.
So it effectively prioritizes the stability of the banking system over everything else.
Yes. By doing this, we are prioritizing banking stability, keeping the principal safe, so markets don't panic over the actual relief of the oppressed. The source references Isaiah 1:16, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression. The argument is that mishpat, true biblical justice, demands that the aggressor's own resources be used for restoration. This hesitation to use the principle is framed as a moral failure born of fear.
It's like if someone burned down my house and the court said, well, the arsonist has a big bank account. We're not going to touch that money, but we will give you the interest that money earns over the next 30 years. Meanwhile, I have nowhere to live.
That is exactly the analogy the source is drawing. And it argues that this hesitation is driven by a fear of the consequences for our own system, rather than a bold stand for the principle of restitution.
That is a tough pill to swallow, but let's look at the other side of the coin for a minute. Segment 3 asks a crucial question. Who decides? Because if we do seize the money, or even if we just use the interest, someone has to make that call. Who is actually pulling the levers here?
Well, at the macro level, it is the EU Council and the G7 finance ministers. They are the ones designing these loan structures and approving the sanctions. But at the micro, or maybe meso level, you have these new bodies being built. There is the Register of Denarigens for Ukraine, which is basically just collecting all the evidence. And then there's a proposed International Claims Commission, which is supposed to adjudicate the value of all those claims.
And the secular source explains that these are separated on purpose. It's not an accident.
No, the institutional design is critical here. The register just records the claims, but doesn't pay anyone a cent. The commission is supposed to decide the amounts, like a court. This separation is meant to prevent political payouts. They want a rules-based process, not just a politician handing out cash to their friends or preferred companies.
But the reformed source looks at this whole structure, specifically the G7 acting as this kind of global arbiter, and it gets very, very nervous. It brings up Abraham Kuyper.
Yes, Kuyper's concept of sphere sovereignty is absolutely essential to reform social theory. The idea is that God has delegated authority to different spheres of life: the family, the church, the state. But these spheres have limits. And the question this source asks is, does a group of finance ministers, the G7, have the biblical warrant to act as a global judge and jury over another nation's wealth?
Right. The state has the sword, as Paul says in Romans, to punish evildoers within its jurisdiction. But does the G7 have jurisdiction over the entire globe's financial assets? That's a huge leap.
And that is the global technocracy concern. The theological source warns that centralizing the authority to seize sovereign assets creates an incredibly dangerous precedent. It calls it the man of lawlessness concern.
Unpack that a bit. That sounds pretty intense.
It draws on the biblical idea that centralized, unaccountable authority in a fallen world inevitably trends toward tyranny. If the G7 can seize Russia's money today because Russia is the bad guy, and let's be very clear, in this war, they are absolutely the aggressor, what happens tomorrow? Could a future coalition, maybe one that is anti-Christian or ideologically driven in a different way, seize the assets of a nation that is deemed non-compliant with other global agendas?
Like, oh, your country doesn't support our climate goals, or your country has restrictive laws on this particular social issue, so we are seizing your central bank reserves.
Precisely. The reformed view of total depravity reminds us that human nature is corrupt and power corrupts. We should not trust any small group of unelected people with that much centralized authority. The source argues for national legal channels like courts, rather than what it calls globalist financial engineering, done by committees.
That is a really important distinction. Courts are supposed to operate on established law and precedent.
Yes.
Ministers operate on policy and, expediency.
And policy changes with the wind. The law is supposed to be stable.
Which leads us perfectly into segment 4, who gets protected, because the reparations trilemma source lists 4 different groups that everyone is trying to protect at the same time, and it's impossible.
And protecting one of them often means exposing another one to risk. You have the victims. They need speed and cash. You have the rule of law that needs due process and legal certainty. You have financial stability. You don't want a market crash. And then you have coalition cohesion. You don't want to get into a fight with your allies over who takes the risk.
Let's zoom in on that financial stability piece, because this is where the secular source gets really specific about Euroclear. Why is everyone so worried about this one bank in Belgium?
Because Euroclear is not a normal bank. It is a central securities depository. Think of it as the plumbing of the global financial system. Trillions of dollars in transactions flow through it every year. And right now, it is under immense, unprecedented stress. Fitch Ratings actually placed Euroclear Bank on rating watch negative.
That is not good. That's a major red flag in the financial world.
It's a huge red flag. And on top of that, Russia has now sued Euroclear in Moscow courts for approximately $230 billion. They are claiming damages because their assets are frozen and they can't get them.
So if Belgium decides to just seize the money and give it to Ukraine, Russia could retaliate against Euroclear specifically.
That is the nightmare scenario. Russia could try to seize Euroclear's assets in other jurisdictions, like China or the UAE, or just bankrupt the entire entity through legal judgments in friendly courts. The government of Belgium is terrified that if they seize the principal, the financial plumbing crashes. And if Euroclear crashes, the shockwaves go through the entire global banking system. It would be a Lehman Brothers moment, but maybe worse.
So the interest-only plan, this Plan C, is basically a way to protect the bank.
That is precisely the theological critique. The Reformed source argues that this plan prioritizes the money changers, the banks and financial institutions, over the actual victims on the ground.
And it points to something really uncomfortable about the profits, doesn't it?
Yes, the perverse incentives argument. The source notes, as we said, that Euroclear made over 3 billion euros in interest in just 9 months because of these frozen assets.
Wait, so the bank holding the frozen money is making billions of dollars in profit because the money is frozen?
Correct. The custodians are profiting from the continuation of the conflict. As long as the assets are stuck there, they earn interest on that massive pile of cash. If the assets were seized and given to Ukraine, the bank loses that liquidity. If they were returned to Russia, the bank loses it. The status quo is actually very profitable for the intermediary.
That feels, well, it feels gross.
It brings to mind Proverbs 20.10, the warning against uneven weights and measures. The critique is that the victim waits for years, getting trickling interest payments while living in rubble, while the banking system is shielded from all reputational risk and is actually profiting handsomely from the inertia.
It really reframes the financial stability argument as a protection of the powerful argument.
It does. It challenges the listener to ask a hard question. Is the stability of our financial system worth the cost of delayed or even denied justice?
But there's another layer to this protection argument. Segment 5 covers the unintended consequences. The secular source talks about something it calls asset geography.
Right. Asset geography is coalition geometry. Because most of the money is in Europe, Europe bears the risk. The U.S. can talk tough and pass laws saying seize it because the money isn't in New York. But Belgium is on the financial front line.
And Russia is not just sitting there taking it. They are actively building their own systems.
This is the retaliation risk. Russia's working overtime to develop alternative financial rails. They're working on something called the A7 network. They're using crypto, and they're working with the BRICS nations to de-dollarize trade. They're trying to build a financial system that the West simply cannot freeze or sanction.
And the theological source uses a fascinating and pretty stark analogy for this, the Tower of Babel.
It's a very sharp connection. The global financial system, things like SWIFT, the role of the dollar, the euro, was a form of common grace. It wasn't perfect, but it allowed for certain unity in trade. It allowed nations to cooperate economically, even if they disagreed politically.
But by weaponizing the system, by freezing assets and banning nations from SWIFT, the West is inadvertently causing a fragmentation. It's a scattering.
Exactly. Just as God scattered the nations at Babel because of their prideful unity. We are now seeing a scattering of nations into competing financial blocs. We are pushing Russia, China, and others to build their own tower, so to speak, one that we can't knock down.
And the source quotes Galatians 6.7, "Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap."
The argument is that If we sow financial weaponization, if we use our banks and our currency as weapons of war, we will reap a world where property rights are no longer respected globally. We are inviting a world where might makes right in the
Yeah.
banking sector. If you use the rule of law as a weapon, eventually the law loses its authority and it just becomes a club.
That is a sobering thought. We might win the battle for Ukraine's funding, but lose the long-term war for the global rule of law.
That is the core of the theological warning in this text.
So where do we go from here? It all feels so stuck. Segment 6 discusses the path forward. The secular source actually has a pretty detailed plan on how to distribute the money if we ever figure out how to get it.
Right. It suggests a two-track model. Yeah. Because you can't just dump $300 billion into a war zone without a careful plan.
Of course not. Corruption is a massive risk.
Huge. So track one is the emergency track. This would be for fast, capped payments for very clear harms. If your house was destroyed and you have the title deed and photos, you get a set amount. If you need urgent medical care because of the war, you get it. It's about fast, efficient, immediate relief.
And track 2.
Track 2 is the adjudication track. It's much slower. This is for the complex claims. Factories that were destroyed, massive infrastructure projects, environmental damage. These require a full, careful review by the Claims Commission to determine the true value.
And the source mentions the Lugano principles. What are those?
Yes, these are basically a set of transparency standards that were agreed upon internationally for Ukraine's eventual recovery. It means audits, public tracking of funds, and civil society oversight. The goal is to make sure the money actually goes to the victims and not into the pockets of local oligarchs or corrupt officials.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, how does the reformed source suggest we, the listeners, who it calls the learners, process all of this? Because it feels like a problem that is way, way above our pay grade.
It offers a concept that I found very helpful. It's called proximate justice.
I like that term. What does it mean?
It means acknowledging that perfect, absolute justice will not happen on this side of eternity. That won't happen until the Great White Throne judgment. We cannot build heaven on earth. So we should strive for the best, most just outcome possible, but we can only achieve imperfect, proximate justice here. We should try to make the thief pay, but we should not expect the system to be flawless or the outcome to be perfect.
So we should manage our expectations.
Precisely. And then there's a heart application as well. It says our support for restitution for making Russia pay should come from a hunger for righteousness, not a hunger for vengeance.
That's a fine line.
It's a hard line to walk, especially during a brutal war. But it shouldn't be about hating Russians. It should be about loving justice and wanting to see the victim made whole.
And there's one final warning in there, too.
Yes. It says we should support the civil magistrate, the government, in its God-given role of punishing evildoers. That's Romans 13. But we must maintain a holy skepticism regarding centralized global authority. We can and should want justice for Ukraine without blindly trusting the G7 to become the world's unelected policeman.
That seems like a really healthy and very reformed balance. Support the injustice, but watch the memes technocracy very, very closely.
I agree completely.
So let's try to synthesize this whole massive discussion. We started with an almost unimaginable pile of frozen money, $260 billion, and a war that has destroyed a nation. We looked at the legal gridlock, this trilemma that keeps that money stuck in a vault in Belgium.
Yeah.
And then we looked at the theological mandate from Scripture that says, very clearly, the thief must pay.
And we saw the tension, this deep, uncomfortable tension. How do we do the right thing, restitution, without breaking the very system that keeps the world orderly? How do we avoid protecting the powerful banks at the expense of the powerless victims?
It all comes down to that question of risk, doesn't it? Are we willing to risk financial stability for the sake of moral clarity? Or do we compromise on justice to keep the markets calm and our own systems safe?
It is the classic conflict between the ideal and the real. And as Reformed thinkers, we know that in a fallen world, that conflict is just, well, it's unavoidable.
We have covered a lot of ground today, from international law to the Book of Exodus, from the vaults of Euroclear to the Tower of Babel.
It really shows that theology isn't just for Sunday mornings. It speaks directly to banking, to war, to international relations, to everything.
Absolutely. I want to leave our listeners with the final provocative thought from our theological source. It's a question that has really been sticking with me since I first read it.
The question is this: if the West sells its birthright of the rule of law for the pottage of quick funding, has it actually lost more than it gained?
That's an Esau reference for those keeping score at home. Selling something permanent and precious for a quick, cheap meal.
Is the quick fix of seizing assets without due process worth the long-term cost of breaking the very legal order we claim to be defending? That is the question we have to wrestle with.
A huge thank you to everyone for thinking through this with us today. It is complex, it is messy, but it absolutely matters. Thanks for listening.
Goodbye.